from at Talking Remote. Oh, I nearly made a mess of that, didn't I, Esther? So, glad to have you all here. I've got a wonderful guest with me, my wonderful friend, Esther Derby. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm glad to be here with you.
Oh, fantastic to have you on. If you like what we're doing, join us at remoteaf.co. Click on the community button and join our community. Lots of people talking about the things we're talking about today. Or join Teamcraft, which is our newsletter. You can get that in the show notes below. Fantastic to have you. Esther, enough of the advertising. The reason we got you on today, I've had the pleasure of working with you for the last couple of years. It's been a lot of good fun. And in that time, you, of course, released your book, which is why we're going to have you on today. Now, the book has a very large title. Would you like to talk to that? Here's what I prepared earlier: 7 rules for positive, productive change, micro shifts. Yes?
Yeah, macro results.
Fantastic. All right. So, firstly, when you were setting out to write this book, what was the thing that pushed you towards writing it? Why did you feel that book needed to be written? I always like to ask authors that.
A couple of things. I had seen so many change efforts and transformations fail. And I had seen so many people just pushed and pushed and pushed. And I had seen so many situations where people just failed to realize the human impact of a change, and just utterly ignored the fact that it might be stressful for people. They, if there's one person I heard at a some kind of networking meeting, and she was talking about well, we eliminated all of these nurse manager roles because it will improve patient care, and why could they resist that? Why are they resisting that? And it's like, well, maybe they don't want to go back to being a floor nurse. Maybe they invested in their education to be involved in this. They're losing status, they're losing position, but this person was just oblivious to it, the human impact of it. And so, for all of those reasons, I decided to write a book that's quite a different approach to change than some of the models that are prevalent out in the world.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing is it is different to your normal standard, ADACARs and all those sort of change models that are very process centric. So, not that they don't have certain places where they work well, but you've got to pair them with things. Yeah, that's right. So, and you set that down as 7 rules. So, we'll talk through the 7 rules today a little bit.
Sure.
But I did try to memorize them as we talked about.
You did a better job than I did remembering what they all were. So
let's go through them. So it's strive for congruence, honor for the past and the present people, assess what it is,
assess what is.
Okay. Attend the networks. Attend to networks. Experiment. Guide and allow for variation, and the last one, use yourself.
Yes.
So that wasn't too bad, right?
Yeah.
So how did you come about the 7 rules before we sort of dig into each one? Because that was interesting. When I was reading it, I was thinking they make sense to me, and they hang together quite cohesively. But how did you come to slicing it into those 7 rules?
Well, I want to say first that these are heuristics, which are rules of thumbs, but you don't want that on a book title. And it's not a stepwise thing, right? These heuristics are guidelines for problem solving, right? So things you need to pay attention to, or things that will help you when an issue comes up. And I would like to say that my brilliant mind just came up with these heuristics. But the truth of the matter is, I was sitting around talking to my friend Dawn Gray, and we were just, it was after a conference, and we were tired and a little batty, and And one of us said, well, what would you attach if we were using change as an acronym? What are the principles you would attach to each letter? And yeah, and I moved them around a little bit and worked with them, but that's actually how it first came about.
Well, there you go. I was interested in that. So, all right. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper and dig into. Let's talk about striving for congruence. That's an interesting one. Even the word just congruence is quite interesting in the context of it. So, talk to me a little bit about what striving for congruence means in this instance.
Well, the way I use congruence is a particular application of the word, and it comes from the work of Virginia Satir. And she says that in every interaction, you have to consider three broad areas. One is yourself and your own wants and needs and capabilities. And then the wants and needs of the capabilities of other people. And then the context that you share. And excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of tea. So when these things are balanced, I think that's when you can access your best thinking and when you can access your empathy. I say strive for because I don't think this is a state that we reach and stay in forever, right? We can get knocked off balance and then we have to kind of get ourselves back on balance. And I think it's important to start from that place to acknowledge what the context is, which is why it is necessary to make a change, why it's desirable to make a change, what is. It acknowledges that there are people who are going to have to give things up, who are going to have to start new things, who are going to have to learn new things, who may feel a sense of loss or confusion. You have to consider their wants and needs and capabilities. And then you have to consider where you're coming from, right? How do you actually approach this change? What are your feelings and attitudes towards the change and the people? And try to just be as clear and authentic as you approach the change. Because everything is easier if you're coming at it from a state of congruence.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me was because we talk quite regularly, obviously, and such that word VUCA is used a lot, but the world has changed. That's what the world is right now. A lot of change, internal and external. And when we have this change organisationally, I think that organisations miss that piece about they have to prepare their people and themselves for change and how they embrace that change. And I think that when you're talking about that striking congruence, that's sort of what was in my head was saying, if you're not thinking about those things that you just spoke about, then you're probably not helping to prepare yourself or your people for that change. Right. Which sort of, sorry, you keep going.
Well, I was just thinking about, the world has been through a lot of changes in the last 5 years, many of not of our choosing. And when you think about, that sort of change, which is done to, happens to without our choosing, our own response to that depends a lot on where, how centered we are, right? Whether we can center ourselves. I mean, when we are acting out of fear, when we are acting out of anger, when we are acting out of, placating, we can't bring our best thinking.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's one of the reasons to just, try to center in yourself. Right. And it's okay. You don't have to deny that you're afraid. You don't have to deny that you're angry. You just have to realize that, acknowledge it, and then try to bring your best thinking to bear rather than just being driven by fear or anger.
And I can see how that flows into, rule number 2, honor the past, present people. So let's talk a little bit about how they link in together and how that one influences change.
Yeah, well, again, it's considering the other people and the context, because whatever people are doing, they're doing it because somebody thought it was a good idea at some point, right? And things are the way they are, not because somebody set out to do something stupid or foolish, but somebody thought things were going to work, and perhaps they did at one time. um, and so I think it's useful to acknowledge that, right? And just to sit with that, and that people were doing the best they could given the situation they were in, right? I remember being at a conference. I think it was an Agile conference even years ago, and someone who was a consultant was bragging about um, how he went into a client and looked at the code and said, you people are lucky to even have a job. You're incompetent, and you know that was not very conducive to actually getting people to want to change, right? When people feel attacked, they often defend, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a normal response. When people feel like they're pushed and their autonomy is impacted, it's the psychological term is reactance. They try to get some autonomy back.
Yeah.
So I think it's super important just to acknowledge, that people were doing the best they could, and that they have something to lose. For many people, they have something to lose in the change. There's always a negative space. There's always some sense of loss, or some sense of, I have to learn this new thing, and I'm going to be incompetent at it for a while. And
it's a fear factor, isn't it? You push that system of work, and you push too hard, it's going to push back, and that usually comes back in the form of people emoting. And I like what you have in there about honor the past, because when you work with very large organizations who've been around for a long time, there is a lot of past. And as you said, those things that have been done that probably aren't working now, they probably were, as you they have a lot of steep history that you can learn from, let alone just on. So I think a lot of people miss that sometimes.
Yeah, I just as I was talking about that, I remembered when I worked for an investment company, and this will tell you how long ago it was. We were trying to get the traders to use mice, computer mouse, and they did not want to. It got labeled resistance, but from their standpoint, learning a mouse slowed them down. It made them feel inept. It reduced their speed, and then they'd be futzing with the mouse instead of thinking about what they were, the trade they were trying to make. And I think that's a really interesting illustration of why people respond the way they do. I mean, they were very smart, very accomplished people, and this was going to slow them down and make them feel incompetent in that little part of their life.
Yeah, particularly when the old green screens, because a lot of that was you knew all the prompts and you knew where you were. I remember it shut my age now, right? And you hardly used the mouse, so I can see how that would affect the change. I think that's also interesting, because that flows into the third rule, which is assess what is, right? And before we jump into that, I think my experience of that is a lot of organisations go headlong into change, or change is something that they attack at a macro, but they don't stop and look at the current state or assess what is, as you say. So that really struck a chord with me. Talk to me a little bit more about that, Esther. Like your version of it.
Yeah, people talk a lot about change starting with a vision, but it actually starts with accepting what is right now, what you're dealing with. And the way I see that show up is, people have this big aspirational change, but they have to get there from where they are. And that involves really accepting the skills people have, the beliefs people have, what they need to unlearn, what they need to relearn, all sorts of things that often aren't addressed solely by, going to a 2 or 3 day training, right? It's far more significant than that. And if you don't address what is creating the current pattern, the pattern is going to reassert itself.
Yeah, again, that's the system pushes back, right? So if you don't take it into account, or it's just going to either revert, or it's going to push back, and that comes in the form of lots of different angst and issues.
Well, I'm sure you've seen some agile transformations where, the names change, but they're now squads, and they now have a scrum master instead of a project manager, and they're doing tiny little waterfalls, but the results are exactly the same. I mean, I actually first saw that in the 80s, 70s and 80s, where you go through this whole thing about we are now going to use a methodology, and they it's going to make us faster. We'll be able to deliver seamlessly. That was a word people used a lot. And the words changed, but the results were the same because they had not addressed what was contributing to the current pattern.
Yeah, I was walking into an organization, one of my first agile coaching gigs, I think, and they showed me their wall. It was all in increments, and sprints, and I thought, gee, this is really great. And they said, yeah, that's our development wall. Now this is our testing wall. Yeah, my face. Yeah, anyway, so as you say, you have to look at that. So the one that interests me though now, as we flow through the rules, is the attend to networks. Talk to me about that one, because that's an interesting one that I don't think a lot of people address when they look at change. So,
well, there are two aspects of networks you need to attend to. One is what networks are you breaking? Because if you are moving people around and you're shifting departments or you're shifting teams, you're undoubtedly breaking some networks. And although we like to think of organizations as, logical and we just follow a process, a lot of stuff gets done through human interactions and who and, you have a good relationship with, and who to talk to and all that other stuff. So when you break those networks, things can slow down that you may not have realized were happening.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the stories in the book is about a company that got rid of their company cafeteria. And after a while, I mean, it took several months, they realized that a lot of the information that led to cross-selling or bringing in additional work happened over lunch. Right. It's just people from different parts of the company would meet in the cafeteria, and once that went away, that communication went away, and it resulted in a slowdown in sales. So they broke a network.
It's an interesting thing because this is a waste. We haven't got the working group that we usually work in. My favorite thing is collaborative connective tissues, which is,
yes, it is.
But that's literally what you're talking about, is those networks. And when I'm talking about that, people say, how many times do you pull your teams apart? How many times do you put them back together? How many times do you break your structures? You create these tribes. And every time you do it, you break those networks that you're talking about, Esther. And I think that's something that they don't take into account in change. Or if you have to do it, they do it in a macro sense. So that's why, like your micro shifts, they just blow it all away and then expect it to come back immediately.
No, and it doesn't. But it's easy to look at the little boxes on the org chart and think, well, we're just moving this over there, and it's very antiseptic, and it doesn't involve the reality of the messiness and the humanness that's involved in getting work done. The other aspect is understanding who people look to in terms of who they're going to take advice from, or if somebody says, well, yeah, that's okay, then they're going to kind of go along with it. Networks are actually hugely influential on our behavior on all sorts of areas. There have been research about, whether people think it's okay to smoke. To a large extent, depends on who you hang out with. If you hang out with smokers, you're likely to think it's fine. There's research that says if you hang out with people who are overweight, you're likely to gain weight, because you gauge what amount you eat based on the people you're surrounded with. So that's another really essential thing to look at, is who in the organization is influential, and can we get them on board? And if they have reservations, if they think it's a bad idea, you're going to have a hard time. You're going to have a really hard time.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I call it the donut economy sometimes too. Is because those people are able to walk around and sort of say, "Can we get this done? Can we get that done?" And people tend to shape and move that way, right? So,
Right.
yeah, I think it's an integral piece that gets missed in every change. Because when you're just focusing on the change process and you're not changing on the people quotient, which is what you're flowing through this conversation, that's when you have a problem. That moves into number 5, which is experiment. Now, this is an interesting one. So, talk to me about experiment, because I think this is the one that how do we get them the time and the space to experiment? But please talk on.
Well, experiments are little things. They're small, so if they don't work, they're not going to cause a lot of disruption. Unlike, we're going to roll this thing out and it's going to disrupt every aspect of your operation. If you do a little experiment, you're going to learn something, and you're going to get useful information. If it doesn't work, why didn't it work? What conditions are necessary for it to work, without causing a lot of disruption, right? So I think they're essential to change in complex organizations. They allow people to get their fingerprints on things. So it's not like everything's imposed. It's people can work on small things, and it doesn't feel as permanent, and there's not so much disruption, and people have a time to learn, so that level of disruption is mitigated.
So I have a good question that's come through. It says basically, how do we get leaders to allow us to have time to make experimental changes rather than big bang changes, as they see that's the way forward?
Well, there's 2 aspects of time. One is, do you have time in your workday to do things? So do you actually have time where you can be thinking and learning, right? So I like to make experiments small enough so that that's not a huge issue, right? Make them so small that it's not going to require you to be working double time to do them. The other aspect about time, and I'm not sure which one was meant here, so I get to address both of them, was, start to end. And my hypothesis, and I have seen this play out several times, I haven't done any rigorous research on it, but so if you start with a big change and you roll it out, it may look like, oh, we're done. But then there's this whole period of time where you're dealing with people's responses, when you're dealing with their reaction, you're finding out all the stuff you didn't work, you're finding out all the stuff that didn't fit, you're finding out all the things you need to put in place to make it work, and you end up with this much time. Where if you do little tiny changes, yeah, we're going to change this little thing and we're learning, and we're going to change this little thing and we're going to change this little thing, and you end up with about the same amount of time. It's just with the big rollout, you have the illusion that it is completed. And this whole period of time where you're fixing stuff, you're dealing with people's responses, you're dealing with learning curves, doesn't get accounted for.
And you end up dealing with a whole lot of mess at the end of the Big Bang that you didn't account for, whereas in the small, shorter increments, you learn, but that didn't work. Okay, then we need to pivot and change or adapt, and it's very Agilesque in its thought, right? Yeah. So I think it's an interesting piece. So the thing for me with the experiments, though, in terms of organizational change. What kind of experiments do you see them attempting to use rather than just massive big bang change?
Well, one, and this is in some ways bigger than what my ideal experiment would be, is, if you want to try working in a new way, see if you can get it to work with one team. Get some people who are interested in trying it and are interested in it, and give them what they need to make it work. If you can get it to work, then you have taken, the "it will never work here" argument off the table. If you can't get it to work with the people who are really interested in it, then, maybe there's something that needs to change first. You'll learn a lot. So I think that is often extremely useful. I have seen experiments as small as, we're going to put a lock on the door so that the vice president doesn't come in and interrupt us. I've seen people, hold office hours as a way to change communication patterns, as a way to manage the interruption. So there's all sorts of little changes you can make.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is splitting them up is the piece that people don't take the time to do. All right, for each of these, we could spend a lot of time talking on all of them. I know I'm sort of shifting it along, but
spend a lot of time talking about all these things.
Yeah. So let's talk about guide and allow for variation.
Yes.
This is a really interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
Do we really need to guide? Don't we just tell?
Well, you can try it. You can try it. This heuristic is an acknowledgement that one size does not fit all. One size just in most cases won't work. And standardization, trying to standardize work that is highly variable, is not actually very effective. It actually creates problems. So this is about allowing for variation. It's going to be a better fit, and people are going to have more ownership if they have a chance to figure out, here's how we need to adapt it where we are. But you have to look at, this is the outcome we want, right? So you have to give people something to move forward. This is the outcome we want. And you have to look at, this is the sort of thing we want to encourage. This is the sort of thing that we want to avoid. So that sets up a sort of lane that people can, as long as you're in that lane, you're not doing something that's illegal or immoral or unethical or unacceptable to the way we want to work, and we're moving towards these things we like, and going towards that goal, people can move within that area. In some ways, I think about it as, this is another idea that came to me when I just happened to be looking across my room at a lamp. And I said, it's kind of like a lamp. So there are certain things that have to be narrowly managed, like something, the plug, there are only a handful of plug configurations because they have to fit into the electrical grid, right? So that's tightly constrained. There are safety issues around the base of the lamp. So that's constrained around safety issues. But other than that, you can pretty much do what you want, depending on what's the decor and what's the use and what are these other constraints, right, that form boundaries. And, light bulbs, there's a handful of maybe a double handful of socket configurations. So that's constrained depending on use and a few other factors. But the shade, you don't want it to catch on fire, but other than that, go to town. So it's, it can be quite open, right? So I think that's, I find that analogy helps people think about, how much variation is appropriate here. the tendency is to either over constrain or under constrain. And I think in my experience, that analogy helps people think about, oh, okay, is this more like the plug where, it has to interface with a larger system, narrowly constrained? Is this, has to be fit for purpose, and purpose is it must look beautiful on someone's table? That's another set of constraints.
I took a few notes on this. I was fiddling around on the left-hand side here, and so because there was a couple of extra ones in this I didn't want to miss, and I think one of the ones I was really interested in terms of when you were thinking about this is the checkbox behaviour. So talk to me a little bit about that checkbox behaviour, because that's an interesting one. It struck a real resonant chord with me when I read it.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we've all seen that where, oh yes, we did a retrospective, or oh yes, we had a stand up. So this often happens when people are, there's a dictate that says, we will have, 20% of our teams will be agile, or, X amount. We're going to grade you on how agile you are, this kind of thing. I think it's very common, and it reflects not communicating what the purpose is or what the value is, or there is no purpose and value, right? So I think a lot of changes do result in sort of checkbox behavior.
Yeah, I think the minute you have that checkbox behavior, it becomes that sort of thing where it's almost like somebody marching, if you use the metaphor, marching around with a clipboard going.
Yeah, well, but what happens is that the people who are exhibiting that behavior are the ones who get blamed when it's the design of the change and the way the change was approached that lead to that sort of behavior.
I've got a question that's come through, which a LinkedIn user, sorry, so I don't know who you are. Is all standardization bad?
No.
That was an easy answer.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain things that must be standardized, right? Like, our electrical grids are highly standardized, and in manufacturing, many things are highly standardized. So if your inputs and your problem are always the same, standardize. I mean, and even within software, there are standards for how we do things. There are protocols for how we connect to various components and so forth. So no, I don't think it's it's don't ever do it. It's like, do it when it's necessary. But the tendency, because we have this sort of legacy of mechanistic thinking about organizations, and applied to all sorts of things, I think there's a tendency to want to standardize everything.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think over standardization, we do see that a lot. Unfortunately, because the standard, you're going to have the same velocities, that person's going to have velocity, and those sorts of things are really bad. How you break work down might be a standard that you need so that you can actually see things, but it doesn't mean that the team has to do exactly what that team does, etc., etc. So, the other one, I'll just a quick. Sorry, keep going. The other one I had a quick note on was boundary stories. You're talking about boundary stories and concrete examples.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit
so
about
that's I learned that from Dave Snowden, and that is, we want to hear more stories. We want to hear fewer stories about this. So these are the positive ones. These are the negative, the undesired ones. We'll figure out what to do based on that. They're really useful. I mean, I think the stories in the book about that. It was talking to an executive who, at their engagement survey, they had gotten some really disappointing results about people feeling like they were blindsided in year-end reviews. So I was talking to her, and she said, "Oh, so we should tell people to meet with people every week, and that's standardizing, right?" And what we ended up with was there are different contexts. There are some people who are very senior who don't need to check in with their manager every week. There are new people who probably do. There are people who are maybe pretty experienced, but they're with a really tough project, or they're learning a new capability within the organization. They have been a developer and now they're trying to learn how to mentor people, so they might want to check in more frequently. So rather than have a standardized thing or have a grid, about trying to make a grid that says, if X is true and Y is true, meet this many times per month. It was, we want to hear more stories about people feeling supported and fewer stories about people feeling blindsided. We want to hear more stories about people feeling my manager is there to help me solve problems that I can't solve on my own, and fewer stories about, I'm with a tough client and abandoned.
It's the one that I wrote down when I was when I was reading through it in this particular part. Ago, I need to try that because I hadn't thought of it in that context. So that's why I did ask the questions. I was actually being, I wanted the answers for myself for that one, people. Okay, we'll move on a little bit, and then we'll move into use yourself. This is an interesting one. Talk to me a little bit about use yourself. This is that concept from social networking that you're using.
Well, it also goes back to congruence, right? Because you and your ability to interact with people and to empathize with people and to be curious and to observe are really essential for change. All right, so your ability to show up and connect with people is essential. I have several friends who are social workers, and I was having a conversation with one of them once about what makes some clinical social workers more effective than others. And so you can take two people who have the same degree, have followed the same curriculum, they have roughly the same professional skills. And the one who is able to show up and be present and be empathetic is going to achieve far more desirable results, far better results than the person who can't do that. Right. And the same is true in change. There's a really beautiful story in Atul Gawande's article, Slow Change, about, I'll let you go read the article. I won't tell you the whole story, but it really, what made it possible was that someone showed up and they were present. And they weren't just trying to pile more work on someone's head, even though there was more work involved. But they were the words that used in the article is they were a friend. And I'm not saying you have to be friends with everybody, but if you can show up and be empathetic and be present, that helps. And empathetic does not mean mollycoddling. Empathetic does not mean, oh, you're right, it's going to be difficult. Okay, we don't have to do it. It means accepting someone else's response as valid, seeing things from their point of view, understanding how it may look to them, understanding what they are losing, what their struggles might be with this. Right? Doesn't mean you don't have to go away and say, oh, okay, well, no, never mind then. But I think just connecting in that way helps people be ready to move on, right? When they feel validated, then they can move to a next step. When they don't feel validated, they tend to hold on.
Yeah, and I think we were talking off the show, where I was on that program I worked for 2 years with a group that I became so close to.
Yes.
That, they'll come from all over the world if we have a reunion, and that's that kind of, we were all friends in a way, even though we have separate lives, etc.
Sure.
We showed up for each other, or we'd show up,
Yeah.
and we knew that person would, something's going wrong, but they're still doing the best that they can do, and when change came along, we embraced change together, which was interesting. I know, Jeff.
Everything's easier with support. Everything.
Yeah, very true. I noticed that within that particular chapter, there's a couple of sort of subheadings, I suppose. But first is curiosity. So
yes, it's a superpower.
Talk to me a little bit about that. Your thoughts on.
I think that for many of us, particularly in the West, I would consider Australia the West, in terms of, European, a lot of European influence, obviously not solely European influence, but, quick decisions, right answers, judgment. And when you're trying to change something, I think it's more useful to be curious about, that's interesting. I wonder why they're doing it that way. Or I wonder how it got to be that way. Or I wonder what constraints people believe are present. Why would a rational person do this thing that looks odd to me? Or why do I think it's odd? It seems normal to them. So I think just being curious and staying out of judgment is, in life in general, is a good skill. But I think it's essential for change.
Yeah, and working with you over the last 2 years, I've learned that the power of saying I have a wonder.
Where did you learn that?
Because it's a very powerful thing. I have a wonder, and it takes you out of judgment and actually makes you ask the question. I have a wonder. How did it do that? How did it do that? So you might not have realized it, but I did take that up. Patience.
Yeah, that's a phrase I use a lot. Oh, I have a wonder about that.
It is correct. Yeah. Patience is the other one.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
Talk to me a little bit about that one.
Well, I think often people think change is a step function. Here, we're going to start here. We're going to do change. Everything's going to be wonderful. And it's not, right? There's all the learning and unlearning, and particularly in large organizations, very little happens quickly. So you just have to be patient. People don't necessarily grasp something the first time they hear it. There's some research that people have to hear a message, I don't know how many times, the more fragmented their attention, the more they have to hear it. That takes time, right? I mean, in marketing, they talk about 7 touches. You have to touch, you have to contact somebody 7 different times in seven, not necessarily 7 different ways, but before, there's going to be much chance of a sale, right? So that's a patience exercise. And it's the same with people taking on a new way of thinking about things or really learning something deeply. It takes time. It takes time. I mean, the first time I was introduced to causal loop diagrams, it was like, it took me a while to understand how they worked. I mean, I understand what they would be useful, but it took me a long time to learn how to work with them. Right? So patience, right? It takes, particularly if you're asking people to learn something that's, significant, it takes time. It takes more than a 2-day class.
Yeah.
Right? So, be patient. Be patient with people, with learning curves, with the fact that, takes a long time to move a big organization.
And that brings us to the last sort of subheading in there, and we're getting close to the end of our time, but I do want to address it as observation, because I think that's,
Mm-hmm.
whilst you said curiosity is a superpower, and I absolutely agree with that, and so did
I saw that.
yeah, so did,
So did Vim. Hi, Vim.
yeah. I would also say that observation is a massive superpower if you use it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like absolutely. I often tell this story about Pin the Tail on the Donkey. It's just a horrible game. It's a children's party game where have you ever played Pin the Tail on the Donkey? There's this picture of a donkey and it's missing a tail and it's very sad. And the object is you're supposed to pin the tail back on the donkey. But before they do that, the kids are blindfolded and spun around till they're dizzy, and then they're supposed to get the tail in the right place. It's like you cannot do change blindfolded, right? Esther Schindler actually found a picture. I have to ask her if I can use it. She found a picture of a family party with kids party playing Pin the Tail on the Donkey. Tails are everywhere, but where they belong. So you have to be able to observe what's happening. You have to be able to observe what happens when you make a change. What are the tiniest changes you can detect? What can you see that says you're pointed in a right direction? What can you notice about what people are talking about that's different than what they talked about before? What do you notice about the humor, right, that's different than it was before? What do you notice about just the way people look in meetings, all sorts of things you can notice and observe that aren't necessarily measurable, right? I mean, you could in theory measure all of those things, but you're probably not going to. So I think that's again, it's another superpower.
I love that. I love that. I'm going to steal that. I love that Pin the Tail of the Donkey, because that's exactly what organisations end up doing, running around like that. So,
hey, it's on the lampshade, it's on the neighbor kid, where I think now they don't actually use physical pins anymore. I think they use Velcro, which seems less dangerous to me. But when I was a kid, it was like stick pins.
Yeah.
You'd injure somebody with those things.
I agree. Oh, man, it's so dangerous.
Yeah. So I hate that. I think that's a horrible game. Just a horrible game.
We're at the end of our time. This is a really great conversation. We managed to touch all of the 7 parts of that. Heuristics, I'll call them from that. But how can people get in touch with it? How can people dig deeper into this, Esther?
Well, buy the book. It's actually going to be on Barrett Kohler, the publisher, is having a sale on all their books on the 27th. So that's the 27th in the US. So it would be a day earlier for you. I'm always confused about that. But if you go to the Barrett Kohler website, all their books are on sale, including this one, 50% off, and free shipping in the US. So that's one way. And of course, you can order it on Amazon as well. So that's one way. You can sign up for my newsletter, which is where I'll let you know when I'm doing various workshops and various other things. And you can look at my podcast, Change by Attraction.
I do recommend that. And I'll put all of those in the show notes.
Right.
You'll be able to get a hold of those. It's been fantastic having you talking remote today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It's been delightful, and I'm so impressed you learned the rules. That took effort on your part.
Hey.
Thank you.
I hope everyone's listening, especially the group we work with. I got a star from Esther. All right. Thank you so much. Have a lovely.